Nico, are you there?
Yes,
Can you close the sound when people join?
I think it's closed. It's
Okay.
turned off now.
All right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Okay. Cool. So, okay. How about we start in 1 minute? Just let's wait a little bit. So I think people are joining. Okay. On time, 8 p.m. Okay, let's start. I think so. Most people are gonna see this show from the YouTube and Bilibili, but here also we have a lot of students here in the GSD. Also, otherwise, so today it's our great honor for China GSD to host this lecture. Talks from Cambridge, the 4th series. So also it's great honor for us to have invited Marika Trotter and Traumer, two of my teachers in SARC, to help give us this wonderful lecture and discussion. So please allow me first introduce these two guests, and then I will leave the talk for wonderful lectures. So Marika Trotter, she is an architectural historian and theorist whose research examines the historical intersections between geology, architecture, and agriculture, as well as the landscape, in the 18th and 19th centuries. She is co-editor of the Contemporary Architectural History collections, Architecture at the Age of Everything Else, and Architecture is All Over. And her writing has appeared in publications such as Harvard Design Magazine, Locke, and AA Files. She received her PhD from Harvard University in 2017, and her work has received funding from the Paul Mellon Center, the Graham Foundation, and the Canadian Center for Architecture, and the Sir John Soanes Museum, among others. She is a full-time faculty member at SARC now, where she coordinates the history and theory curriculum. Peter Traumer was born in Graz, Austria, and received his master's degree at the Technical University in Graz by Gunther Dominik, and his postgraduate degree at the Black Institute in Amsterdam. He is currently the Dean of Architecture Academy at University Innsbruck in Austria, and also a professor for urban design and the head of Institute for Urban Design at the University of Innsbruck. He was the head of the Associative Design program at the Black Institute in Rotterdam from 2004 to 2010, and a guest professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, as well as many other schools. Traumer was a project architect at a UN Studio from 2016 to 2000, and he has since had his own practice afterwards. He lectures and invited as a critique at the AA School, the University of Applied Art in Vienna, the IAAC in Spain, the Black Institute, the School of Design in Philadelphia, Rice University, Harvard GSD, and at the Yale School of Architecture. He exhibited his wonderful works at the Venice Biennale in 2006 and 2012. So today's lecture topic, Marika and Peter are going to give us is no idea but things, which is a very, very interesting topic. But I will not say that much about this. I will leave the space to Marika first to deliver these meanings for this wonderful topic first. Please, Marika.
Thanks for having us. I always relish the opportunity to have a proper intellectual discussion with Peter, who is one of the bright lights at SCI-Arc and indeed in architecture. So thank you very much for hosting this. So yeah, the title, No Ideas But in Things, some of you may have recognized it. It comes from a very well-known line by the American poet and physician William Carlos Williams. And he wrote the line in think it was like a 1926 or 1927 poem. He had several iterations of the poem. It only shows up in one, called Patterson. And what he was talking about radically transformed the way people thought about poetry. And then it had these implications beyond that in writing in general, particularly in American writing. This is something that I often notice, by the way, when I'm looking at student writing and students are coming from other places outside of the American context. They might have very different ideas of what good writing means, but in the United States, we have been profoundly influenced by this one little line, no ideas but in things. And if I could break it down, what it means is, if you want to make a new idea, or you want to develop a consequent line of thought, there is no way to do that as long as you stay within the abstract, safe space of general ideas, general concepts. The only way you're going to actually be able to get down and do two things at once, which we're always trying to do as intellectuals. One is communicate in a way that's sticky and memorable. And the other is have a thought that's worth communicating in that way. The only way you're going to do those two things at the same time is by dealing in specifics and dealing with objects. And those objects have to be taken one by one, and they have to be examined thoroughly. They can't simply be glossed as though they were abstract representations of a known type or some kind of vague aspiration. They also are not ideological by nature. So you might be able to produce something that feels like a philosophy of how you might do, let's say, architecture, just since we're talking to architects. But unless you actually test that through specific objects, specific moves, specific case studies, specific physical things, you're never going to know if the idea is consequent or not. You may actually have come up with something that has no bearing whatsoever on what we are all here to work on together. But you will actually be the last person to realize that. So no ideas but in things means something kind of rather profound, and something that I think in architecture we've only recently begun to acknowledge. So treating that as the title for today's talk is a natural thing to do when we're engaging with somebody like Peter Trimmer, who always deals with specifics. And he was the sort of person, like, as you guys, some of you will know, who've had him in reviews or have interacted with him. He's always the person who's pulling a precedent or a case study or an instance and bringing it to bear. It's never about some kind of general sense of, you know, this is better than that. It's always about, oh, this reminds me of, and the thing that it reminds of is a specific instance that's doing a specific thing. So I think it makes sense. And I want to hear more about, I think Peter's going to tell us a little bit more about the work that he's been doing, and we'll look at it through that lens. And then hopefully we'll be able to bring the conversation back around to what this means for the way that we practice in architecture. And when I say practice, I mean the way that we learn and teach, as well as the way that we then try to implement as we move farther along the trajectories of our careers. All right, Peter.
No, it's beautiful. Look, Marika, it's beautiful, and Eugene, how you have set up all these things, and I'm really happy to share some of these ideas, especially because with Marika over the last couple of years we had some of these debates. Yeah, and as all of you know, we are all influenced, by larger cultural events that happen to us, and that somehow question us as architects or practitioner, what does it mean to our discipline? Yeah. So what Marika actually said, and we cannot say, is in principle something that we have shared, that suddenly this idea about things appeared. And I thought once, and I don't know if Eugene, if you saw the work, but I thought then once, why not trying to test this, what Marika just said, by perhaps the most known object or the most known architectural drawing in the history of at least Western architecture, and that was the Piranesi plan. Yeah. So what I'm going to show you is how such an idea to test entities like this Piranesi plan, yeah, and look how ideas move through this entity, I thought I can share this as a little bit of context, yeah, and start my little lecture with an introduction to basically frame how the discipline of architecture so far, yeah, has always tried to find something deeper, yeah, to architecture to which we can rely our ideas. You know, today it's object, but in the past there were other things. So if you want, I share a little bit some of these images with you, and then I think we openly can talk, Marika, because it's something we already, Marika already we had a pre-talk on that, and she also participated in this publication, but so that you can see a little bit of kind of an insight what we could mean or trigger a debate with that. Yeah, is it fine? So so here my lecture. This idea that Marika has brought up, you know, for this little talk, no ideas, but in things. The interesting thing is, you know, that I was always interested in when this idea about objects came. What is it when we talk about architecture? What do we mean by that? You know, and I once thought I could make a kind of a little bit a kind of a fourfold diagram where you could say that every building, you know, has a form and a use. Don't be don't be a little bit confused when I say use. It's a diagram that I also have developed a little bit with Graham Harman, and he suggested me not to use the word function. I should use the word use, because it basically means that a building is used for something which we traditionally call architecture or you know, function. And then on the other hand side, we also can say in this fourfold diagram, we have something that is a zero in use, a zero form, which means it can be any endless amount of use that a building can have on an endless amount of forms. So when we look then, how did we in the discipline look to architecture? Then we can say we always thought that once matter is different. You know, if you think about modernism, you know, it was all about how thermodynamic, engineering, material organizations, they are deeper than all the buildings, yeah? But then, of course, in our postmodern era after the Second World War, we thought, no, behind the form, there's something even deeper than that, and that is the type. You know, there's something, you know, typological that is deeper than all this kind of architecture. Yeah, and then there was the other counterpart, which I think was also mainly focused by the 68 generation, which was the idea of function. And by function, I mean not now the use, I mean what a building can do. You know, it has a social political meaning, it produces events, it produces something that intrigues it, that it can be political, whatever, you know. But I think what Marika has introduced and what I think our cultural debate emerged was the idea that perhaps today there is a debate that something else is deeper than method, type, or function, and that is the idea of the object, yeah? Which means in an object lies an endless amount of possibilities of uses and forms. We don't know yet, but how can we unreveal them? And so this little study that I have done on this subject was then to take basically the most, let's say, most known entity or object of the architectural discipline, this Piranesi plan, because I thought there had been so many people who had ideas onto this plan, but no one actually studied how these ideas entered in the plan. So how the plan actually takes on these ideas in itself. So people have used the plan to use forms of abstraction out of it, but no one has thought these ideas back onto the plan. Yeah, and so this was a little bit of kind of the reason of this publication, to join a lot of participants like Kipnis, Eisenman, and Marika, and also others, to really contribute to this idea. So here was this idea. The idea was to take this plan and then go through many architects' theses and see how this plan, how these theses would enter into this plan. And here are some of these images, for example, you know, so we, first of all, we have redrawn the plan for us. So for example, here, this would be a reading of the plan of Vitruvius if you move his idea of symmetries, you know, into the plan, yeah? So this was a kind of a first reading, that what would be a Vitruvian idea, you know, how would it emerge within this plan? Well, this one, for example, Le Corbusier's voids and formal diagrams, how would the plan take on Le Corbusier's idea, in this case, kind of a Boolean operation of solid and voids. Or, for example, what would Eisenman's grid do to the plan? Yeah, and so, for example, you see it would come up, the plan would sort of unfold a kind of a completely catalog, of grids, of all kind of not only radial and things, but overlapping grids in itself, So this was the Eisenman reading. And then I thought, of course, I couldn't do it without an old friend of mine, Mr. Aureli, and see what would the Aureli walls, do to the Piranesi plan. And then suddenly you would figure out that actually there's a kind of a whole layer of walls within this plan of Piranesi. Or for example, what I was very surprised that even when Colin Rowe wrote a book and is known as the Nolli plan favorite, there is actually a Boucher space within the Campo Marzio, and these are all these little figural cells, that sort of produce an architecture of Boucher's. And here, for example, also something was interesting to look at Unger's thesis of the house in the house. So what would the plan be as a house in a house? So you see a 3-fold house, a 4-fold house, a 6-fold house. And of course, it goes on, like here, for example, the mask of John Haydock, and do I have one more? Yeah, and even I was reading it once through Jumi's idea of the events. So what kind of events I embedded in this plan? So this study actually brought me to this idea, what if I look at this plan, not from an idea, but from another plan? What if I look into this plan and throwing another plan into this? So this was then my contribution. So here, for example, are some of the results that we did on the design of these projects. But the really aim of this publication was, what if I use a plan as a device to read a plan? And I called it the kind of an idea of the object plan. So what I did in this study, I took the Campo Marzio as a plan and read it through a plan that all of us know, and that is the Commissioner Plan of 1811 by Manhattan. So the object plan that I have contributed to this presentation was, what if the Campo Marzio plan from 1762 meets the Commissioner Plan of 1811 of Manhattan? So what I mean by that is this: if we know any city, and we know, for example, Manhattan, we know that the subdivision of land gives us a very clear reading what we think a city is, because in principle, there are only two kinds of properties. There's a private property, it can be owned by someone, it can be developed, and there is a collective property, and that is our streets. So there are only actually two kinds of properties, the one that unites all the individual ones. So then I thought, what if I take this plan and move it into the Campo Marzio? And here comes this project. And what this project suddenly unreveals are completely new forms of property boundaries. So for example, here, the Villa Arunta would have a property within a property, or sometimes a property would be so tiny that it only would be on the edge, or a property would be like a street, or a property would be not even accessible without other properties. So suddenly I realized, when you read it through a reading of properties, you might get completely new forms of constellations, that we have never thought a kind of city could look like. And the aim of this whole study, or for example, here, properties that are in principle like linear bands that are lined up next to each other. And so the idea of this thing would be, what if I take this property line and now develop a city out of this? Now, this work has not been done, and I hope it follows, but I found it a very intriguing thought to see what kind of forms of shared ownership, collective ownership, or where one belongs to the other, or one is only accessible through the other, or one, because of its form, can only carry on certain functions. So what this whole study meant is that behind of each of these diagrams relies an endless amount of new kind of urban configuration with possible unknown urban functions, which we haven't seen yet. So this was kind of my little contribution. And so if you bring it back to this idea that Marika said, what are, let's say, ideas, no ideas, but doing things, then you would say that this kind of Campo Marzio plan, if you read it through another plan, unreveals perhaps new forms and new functions, like, for example, this diagram suggests, ones that we don't know yet. I hope that this little contribution gives a kind of an idea of a debate. And I hope that in my upcoming book, because Marika already wrote one recently with Tom Wiscombe, so you know I also have to throw my ideas. I hope that in the upcoming book, you know, some of these things get a little bit deeper explained, but I hope it can give a kind of an introduction to our little debate. Thanks for listening, and it's open for discussion, Marika.
Well, I have a couple of questions. First of all, I thought that was a super fascinating run through. And, you know, I've seen this work before. I actually was a small contributor to that volume, but I don't think that I fully realized the extent to which you were, you know, that there's a line in architecture that I want to just remind everybody of. I'm not sure that it appears very often at the GSD, but you should remember it. And it's Peter just gave a masterclass in it, which is the very, very true statement. The last person I heard to say it was Jesse Reiser of Reiser Moto down at Princeton. He said, you know, people often get very confused these days about sources for architectural work. But the more you practice and the more you're involved in this field, and then he, I believe, went on to also point out that this is the same in any other field that he can think of, which I would also agree with. Work comes from work. Work comes from work. And what Peter just walked you through was, if you say initially you're going to focus on things rather than ideas, and you're going to understand that your ideas are going to come through the things rather than sort of starting with the idea and then hopefully being able to generate the things, which I would encourage all of you to test out for yourselves. You have to ask yourself what things you're going to start with. Like, are you going to start with a coffee cup? Are you going to start with a postcard? Are you going to start with a piece of fabric? Are you going to start? And I see a lot of students wrestling with this. So I do a lot of work here at SciArc with thesis, master's thesis, and BArch thesis, which we have a BArch program here, et cetera, et cetera. So like all different levels of people trying to figure this out. All right, if you're going to start with things, what things are you going to start with? And sometimes people come up with really interesting answers to that question. Like they'll say, I'm going to start with a plastiglomerate, which is a new form of half plastic, half rock, usually partial coral stuck in there somewhere, that has started to wash up on the shores of our beaches all around the world, our continents all around the world. Or it'll be something like, I'm going to start with a piece of felt. That was very common for a while because a lot of people were reading a philosopher named Gilles Deleuze and learning about felt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I would advocate is a straighter line toward any kind of object that you might really want to develop for a long period of time, is to start with other architecture. And there's a strange resistance to doing that, which I think is we could talk about this more. I think it's the product of a lot of people being very comfortable with smaller and smaller pieces of esoterica in academia. That's something that's been going on for generations. But if you can force yourself to say, hey, I'm interested in plans, I'm going to start with a plan. And then my way of complicating that or enriching that is going to be adding another plan. Then not only are you getting ideas from your things, but you're getting objects from your objects. And you're starting with a rich set of ingredients, as if you intended to build something from what was already there rather than the kind of, sometimes very naive assumption that it's better to start from scratch, if that makes sense. So that really struck me as I was listening to you, Peter. And I think it's such a good object lesson, pun intended, I suppose, for students that are listening to this conversation, to see how one might begin to read architecture through architecture, and how one might begin to think plan through plan, and how one might begin to build theory from things. So thanks for that.
No, look, it's interesting that you say this, and I have to say it evolved out of this study, that I suddenly thought, why have no one, read it through another architectural piece, not through an abstract idea, but through another plan. But perhaps it's also because, I'm related to the city, but I have also, Eugene, to tell you, and this is perhaps also why I do this work, is perhaps the generation that I grew up with was always trying to find something external to architecture, even when their work in themselves was very, very innovative architecturally. There was always a hiding towards the purity of the building itself. There was always a kind of external narrative, added onto that, in order to propagate, sell it. And I always wondered why this is, because because the buildings in themselves had a certain kind of a richness, in relationship to other buildings, that I realized, and I think this is what I think I share with Marika, that my belief is that if I look to all architects that I have met, eventually they reference, there is an inherited, let's say, carry on of a knowledge of other buildings, that eventually trigger these buildings. They are not, they might be external, but they actually instrumentalized by using other ideas of pre-existing buildings. I give you a very beautiful example about Wolf Briggs. In the meantime, a good friend of mine, he would say, that the world is complex and all these things. But if you really look about his idea of the one column project, it is an evolve of Le Corbusier's idea, of the one column project, to unreveal something. So even when the external things, you might be influenced by Deleuze or philosophy, but it's materialized, in their work through other work. And this is perhaps what I became more and more interested in, into buildings' capacity not to be indeterminate, and they can become anything, but they are over-determined, and perhaps this is a kind of a little idea to find their over-determinacy. What can there be more than what we thought of it?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's interesting because I often feel deep pangs of frustration when I listen to people from outside of my field talking about buildings, because they tend to reduce them to, it's kind of what I like the way that you used overdetermined just now, Peter, because it reminds me of something that Graham Harman says that I like, which is just because a thing could be reduced to a set of consequences of other things on one hand, or it reduced to a pile of atoms with specific molecular connections on the other, doesn't mean that that is the thing. The thing is still the thing. And just thinking that somehow you can see through that to something that's more fundamental is usually a mistake. And I have found that to be true for myself. When I hear other people from outside of architecture talking about architecture, I find them doing something very analogous. So they will begin to talk about all of the societal forces that produced a piece of architecture, or they'll begin to talk about it in terms of its consequences. Like, you can't like the CCTV tower by OMA because a number of construction workers died during the building of that building. And you're thinking, well, so is the value of a piece of architecture the experience of the ethics of the building site? Because that would be a remarkable importation of another set of ideas into the realm of architecture. It's not saying it's invalid, you know, but it's just pointing out that one is not the same as the other. One is not a complete evaluation of the other. What I've been surprised to see developing recently within our own discourse is the same kind of thing, where oftentimes I feel like people are talking about everything but architecture when they're supposed to be talking about architecture. And the reason that's a problem is because it confuses the next generation. So it confuses you guys. So all of you listening, what I would say to you is, don't be so quick to turn your attention to a set of ideologies that feel like they are right. Whatever you think those are, that are coming from like some other source. Try to focus on the particular things. And what you will find is wonder and curiosity and value, rather than kind of not being able to answer a question like, what is your favorite building and why?
You know, Marika, there's also an interesting aspect of this. You know, we always think that we can have a correlation, yeah, between form and content, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So when we are interested about political issues, we always think that content, you know, can be instrumentalized formally. You know, there's a correlation. And the strange thing I have discovered is, you know, that, and this is, I think what I showed also in this diagram, that there is no correlation between these two things in architecture. You know, not only theoretically that someone like Aldo Rossi would say type can take on all the functions, or Koolhaas would argue that he could construct his invents in any form. Yeah. But also, for example, I have in my PhD studied, for example, the linear city. Yeah. And it was very interesting. The linear city was not only a socialist utopia, it was a welfare state utopia. It was even a Georgian utopia, yeah, from a Georgism, which was a kind of a theory to hybridize communism, or let's say socialism with liberalism. So basically, that's what I found so interesting on the word zero. Any form could become various forms of political agency, and any political idea can emerge into an endless amount of forms. So you see, and that I think is to me the interesting thing, that whatever we find within the history of architecture is that certain kind of uses reappear, or certain kind of ideas or what I think reappear in a multiplicity of different entities, and that correlation is not there. And I think that's, to me, was a little bit the intriguing point in this last diagram of the zero form, zero function, or that I think, you know, I took, of course, from Graham Hammond, that we will never know, and we will never have full access what something can become, what something will be. Yeah, we are always astonished, you know, that it can be even something else. And I was astonished that you could read, for example, Piranesi plan for a Manhattan subdivision of land. Yeah, so, and I think that's to me the interesting thing is not so much to say, here is something what I believe in, and it has, and I want to transport it into a form. No. It can come within a multiplicity of shapes and so on. Yeah. And I think
what I like about, sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I just wanted to say, I think I felt very liberated by suddenly realizing that this division is at stake. Yeah. You know, that and I found that very interesting for me to work actually on. Yeah, because imagine this correlation would be at stake, we would not know what to do.
Well, but I also think it comes back to our title for today's little conversation. It's very it's a form of intellectual rigor to look at things very specifically with expertise and to develop that expertise. You know, think about the first time, for those of you, if there are people in the audience that know cars very well. Now, I don't know cars very well. So I open the hood of my car and I look at it and it's a bunch of stuff and I don't know what any of the stuff does and I don't know what any of it means and I don't know the relationships between one thing and the other. All I know is that something's not going and there's steam coming out of that thing and that might be bad, right? But I do know a lot about clothing construction and I can point out the particular type of yoking or the particular type of seaming or the particular type of patterning that's producing the particular draping. And I can talk about that with a lot more specificity. So when I look at somebody's clothing, I'm getting a lot more out of it than somebody's car. And I imagine for many of you, it'd be the other way around, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So whatever you're into, it's something that you begin to develop an expertise in. You begin to know the names of things, you understand the relationships, you understand how this carburetor is different from that carburetor, or that engine is better or worse than that, you know, so forth and so on. Or, you know, you look at a dress and you say, well, that dress is made out of this material, it's going to do this, and that dress is, you know, whatever it is. That being able to be specific about what you're seeing and specific about what you're talking about it demands something from you. It demands that you be patient and learn and not have kind of ready-made judgments. It demands that you be curious and open and approach the world with a sense of discovery and wonder and not knowing. And it's much easier to come into a situation where you're learning about something like architecture or something like cars or something like, I don't know, NFTs, whatever the hell, food, and come in with a set of likes and dislikes and pre-existing judgments that you just kind of apply without knowledge. And it's always a temptation to do that. But if you can hold that off and you can start getting into the kind of detail that requires looking and looking and looking again, and being able to look at things like Peter just showed from multiple vantages and with multiple filters, then you begin to build up something that approaches like a rich field of possibilities from which then you can draw. And that field of possibilities comes with you. It's portable. You can use it on this or on that, because as Peter just said, these issues and these ideas and these forms of expertise and these specifics and these objects and all, you know, plans and sections and maneuvers, corners, columns, all of those things, they're non-correlated, which means that you can pick them up and transform them depending on the opportunities at hand. So it's like walking down the street like a regular human versus walking down the street like a ninja. You walk down the street like a parkour specialist. You walk down the street like I walk down the street. I'm like, oh, you know, sidewalk and the crosswalk and the, you know, you obey the rules and you just walk. But if you're like an expert parkour practitioner, the street becomes a web of mesmerizing possibilities that present themselves in all their sparkling specificity and detail, changing at every moment. And, you know, that's the kind of thinking and the kind of creativity that we need in the world. And architecture is a very big part of the world that we continue to share and we continue to build. Not maybe in the dull sense of a kind of general built environment, which to me immediately conjures kind of a gray brick randomness, but in the sense that it's architectural ideas at architectural scales that must be implemented if we are going to produce the kind of society-wide and global and scale transformation that we must produce if we want our children and our children's children to come into a world of possibility and bounty rather than one that is ruined.
You know, it's interesting, Rico, yeah, what I just crossed in my mind, you know, and I see Eugene, and we spoke a lot also about China. It is interesting, you know, that China over the last 25 years was this space
Mhm.
in which these opportunities got completely, there was a kind of a zeroness in the last 25 years, that a world of unimaginable entities and cities came alive. You know what I mean? That
Mhm.
no one have thought before that they are possible. So I think it's sometimes we forget the kind of originality, yeah, of that environment or of that circumstances that is the ground, yeah, for having entities that we thought before could never work suddenly became constructed and real, you know. And I think there's something also unique to that, you know, that um we forget how the reality, how powerful the reality actually is, you know. And I think this is where I think it also comes across, Marika, that we see ideas or buildings happening that we sometimes even don't know the author, but somehow there is a kind of knowledge out there that, you know, drives this kind of new forms of origination. And so I think it's really interesting when you think about what happened over the last 25 years, you know, what the world has created, you know, and how it actually evolved, you know, and that comes in principle by a certain kind of you know, knowing how to unreveal qualities that we haven't thought that are embedded within these realities. And I think that's where
Yeah, I agree.
we got excited in these objects again, even when it has this very strange, let's say, connotation about phenomenology, which had used in architecture more on a kind of vernacular you know, translation. Yeah, and I think even in China, I saw some of these kind of new young architects, you know, dealing with a kind of a phenomenological relationship to landscape. Yeah, but I think there's another kind of idea to look into entities like buildings again, you know, which I think we always have done.
Well, it's interesting because that the problem that I always have with the word object is when I put the word object next to the word building, and I then produce an object building in my ideation separated from things, although I immediately can conjure many buildings that would fit that description, many of which are in China, many of which are elsewhere in the world. What feels not right about that, or not rich about that, or not promising about that is some very simplistic understanding of a building as an object separated from the city, or a building as an object separated from its larger consequences. So I want to be very careful that neither Peter or I are advocating for the building as an art sculpture placed on a plinth in the city and having no relation to anything else. That is kind of foreign to the way either one of us thinks about what we do and what we imagine architecture should become. When we talk about the objecthood of buildings, what we're talking about is their inexhaustible qualities, or their unknown and as yet undiscovered potentials that can be brought to light and can be used in new and interesting ways, in new and interesting forms of connection to context, for example. And then the other problem I think with object is that it implies subject to a lot of people. So there's the old dichotomy of the object versus the subject. And for those of you at the GSD who have had the pleasure of going through Michael Hazian building text and context at some point, you may have heard him talk about the psychoanalytical discovery that you really can't have objects unless you have subjects, and you can't really have subjects unless you have objects. And that the idea of subjectivity implies already a sense of outsiderishness or otherness with all the other things that you encounter. What I think is really promising about the Chinese approach to the environment, including buildings, but also including more phenomenologically at hand things like mountains and paintings and poetry and, you know, the other four ancient arts, etc., is that woven through that discourse and woven through those different cultural practices is an incredible conviction that there is no outside. That there, you know, there's a line of poetry, which I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the author of at the moment, but there's a line of poetry that's referring to a very great landscape painting of a mountain. And the poet says, "Why can I not see the true shape of whatever the name of the mountain is?" And the answer in the next line is, because I'm in it, because I am in the mountain. And having some sense that we're in this thing, and that the things that we're picking up and wondering about and discovering are things that we are within and among, rather than the old idea of a subject somehow magically standing outside of everything and then producing objects that they lob from a distance into the world, is, I think, a necessary discovery and a necessary factor of how we might use objects differently now than we used them in the past.
Well,
You know what
it
I'm
goes
saying.
even-
You know what I'm saying,
No,
Peter,
I,
because
you know, it goes even further, you know, it goes even, yeah, no, it goes even this the thing is that you would then, and this is what I think we all share, is what are you doing as an architect, you know? And what is the role that you're doing? And I think, having said that, you are within this world of democratic entities in which you just do nothing else, as you are where parts of one quality, you know, are just moving through you into the parts of the other quality. You're just part of that same, you know, geological how to say context, you know. And perhaps that's what we have forgotten in the West sometimes, you know, that in other cultures there has been perhaps a much more, how to say, you know, less detached enlightenment, you know, where the subject is so getting detached from that world, yeah, that you're much more embedded, yeah, within it, you know. And I think
well, I think
Mhm.
also the kind of the end result of thinking through things rather than through ideas is that you are forced to acknowledge the embeddedness of yourself. Yeah, that you're forced to acknowledge that you actually do think through things all the time. You're not just thinking as some kind of abstract entity that somehow is separated from everything that you're engaging with. You are engaging. And engaging, you know, it's funny, the root of the word engage, engage, from Old French, it literally means to make a wager, to place a bet. And I like to think of
Mhm.
architecture like that. Architecture is making a wager, it's placing a bet. There's an American expression, putting skin in the game. Put some skin in the game. It means stop standing outside the world in judgment, roll up your sleeves and get involved. Make a wager, make a bet, try to make something. And that's what architects do, actually, when they're really doing architecture. The cool, like, to me, the ultimate goal of architecture is to try really, really hard to make something out of the particular possibilities of one's time that should have been impossible, but that nevertheless manages to appear.
You see, that's why in my thesis, Le Corbusier architecture can be explained like that. You know, what if a Greek temple is meeting industrialization, yeah, through the hands of Le Corbusier? Yeah. So in principle, I think what Le Corbusier did is just, you know, bringing, you know, these things together, yeah, that before have not been thought as that they can meet, you know, and I think Yeah.
Well, that's why I like that. So Le Corbusier, so you guys will know this because you have very good
I thought I'd
historical
probably
education.
bring a real Boston project, a real like Corbusian GSD project, I hope
That's right.
it's
You guys could all kind of take a pilgrimage across the street to the Carpenter Center after this, stand there freezing. No, Le Corbusier is a really good example because Le Corbusier shows up at the Acropolis. He's a painter. He wants to do painting. Why does he want to do painting? Because he wants to work in composition. He wants to create new possibilities for space. He's working in the kind of space, the new possibilities opened up by Cubism, new understanding of time and composition, and being able to present multiple facets of things that had never been thought possible before. Shows up at the Acropolis and he decides to become an architect. And I always imagine him crying. He's up there, he's looking out at all this magnificent ruination and discovering Choisy's understanding of picturesque kind of movement-based experience of architecture, moving in space, plastic forms and the light and all the rest of it. And he has this one line in Toward an Architecture where he points out what it is that architecture can do that painting cannot. And he says, what this building can do, I think at that point he's talking about the Parthenon, what this building can do is it can sweep up the desolate landscape and make it serve the composition. Now just think about that for 5 hot seconds. Architecture can take the mess and the thinginess and the random kind of tinsel and cigarette butts and paper coffee cups and just detritus of the world, and it can sweep it up and make it serve the composition. It can make it matter. It can make it hit you. It can make you stop. It can make you feel like there might be something exciting and interesting and worthwhile and noble that you might be able to do. There's never been a time in our history, at least in my little life for sure, when we've needed more of that than we do now. That we are living. I'm sure you all are all aware of the news today, and I'm sure you're all aware of the implications of that news. And I'm sure that you are all well aware of the climate crisis that is unfolding every day beneath our feet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Never have we needed more devices, and architectural devices are really good at this, that can sweep up the desolate landscape and make them serve the composition like a punch to the chest. Takes your breath away. That's what architecture can do. But it takes a level of expertise, and it takes a level of specificity, and it takes a level of engagement, putting skin in the game, making a bet, making a wager, trying something and being willing to fail catastrophically in order to achieve that.
Yeah, great. Eugene, do you want us for the last couple of minutes?
Yeah, I think
to some questions.
Sure. Yeah. So I think so. First, really appreciate for both of you give us such wonderful dialogue and lecture. So I think I will let Kevin host the question and answer and discussion panel. Maybe we have 15 minutes discussion or question answer. So Kevin, please.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for a great presentation. I guess while people are maybe getting their thoughts together, I can start off with the quick one. When you were talking about opening the hood of your car and not knowing what any of it means versus when you were talking about clothing construction. It reminds me a bit, read once Heidegger's tool analysis, where aesthetics are subsumed into function, and true judgment only begins when that function is interrupted. Like you never notice a pen until the ink runs out. And I was just wondering, isn't the prejudice of knowing how something works or knowing how something functions, for example, in your clothing construction, knowing what the function of a certain stitch is, isn't the prejudice of knowing that simultaneously, isn't it diminishing your experience of that thing as well, in addition to making it richer? Yeah.
Um, do you have any interests outside of architecture? Like something that you kind of that you follow, maybe music?
Yeah,
Do
jazz.
you write music? Do you play jazz?
I do.
Okay. So then if I were to tell you that the way that you make new music, particularly in an improvisatory space like jazz, is to not know about music, would you accept that statement?
I could. I mean, there's a whole notion of outsider art as well that you could bring into it, right? Where naivete leads to something that breaks convention, but in a productive way.
Naivete is something that may every once in a while align with genius. But as a general strategy for your life, I wouldn't bet on it. If you want to know about music enough to engage with it in an active way, then all you have to do is you have to balance your sense of what something is, knowing its name and knowing how it has been used in the past, with a sense of curiosity and passion, I suppose. And I know that you know what I'm talking about if you play jazz, yeah? A sense that this particular chord sequence could follow from that one, but doesn't have to. That sense of possibility that opens up the more you listen and the more that you attend and the more that you spend time with a particular practice or a particular cultural a way of expression, is not at all the same as reducing the world to a set of raw resources or a set of tools that then simply become invisible by nature of your use of them.
You know, it's interesting, you know, Kevin, you know, the the work of Heidegger, and so you know, is always, I think, in architecture, like everything else, you know, becomes re-originated. You know, there's no, you know, for example, I know that hardly anyone know that, for example, Mr. Raymond Abraham, you know, was a very Heideggerian thing. You don't know if he read Heidegger right or wrong. Perhaps it doesn't matter. But the only thing what he unrevealed through this, but you could even say Raymond Abraham's work is when a sentence by Heidegger is meeting a building, which basically means because of Heidegger talking about the earth and the sky, he suddenly thought, well, when a building has to stand on the ground, I can actually sink it into the ground. So what I'm saying is he found something within the building, yeah, that he would not have thought of if he doesn't meet it or join it or relate it to something that he has read, you know? And so even when he would study it, it needed the disciplinary knowledge to understand what buildings can do in order to originate something that moves into it, you know? And so I always found these aspects right. You know, I'm not a philosopher. I have no idea what what Heidegger is writing. I think Graham Harman is the only one who gave me at least a slight understanding that Heidegger meant that objects are unconsciously always there. They only when they break or only when something is wrong, suddenly we know that they are there, but they actually always unconsciously, yeah. But you know, the question is, what do we do? What do we do when we do architecture? You know, and so I think that's where Marika comes. If you want to really, let's say, innovate something or find something, I think it always goes that you know buildings, but you move something into that, you know, yeah, that allows it, you know, to basically originate another form, another use, another thing. But you needed to have a kind of knowledge, because otherwise you don't know how to join them, how to fuse them. Yeah. No, I mean, someone said, you tune, basically you could also say Abraham, Heidegger tuned buildings through Abraham. You know what I mean? Like a chess player, like he tuned it, by trying to push something in that something comes out. Yeah. So this is how I see it. I don't see that you are a subject. No, you just move. If you are, then you move other things into them to somehow trigger something to come out that is embedded already as a quality within the object. That's what I mean by overdetermined, which I found interesting as the kind of Deleuzian idea of indeterminate, that meaning, that it's overdetermined. There is already qualities within entities, buildings, whatever they are. We don't know yet what they all can become, and I think this is what I guess, Marika, we share in recent history of architectural disciplinary reading, that we don't need to go always outside. No, the qualities lie within the whole culture of buildings itself.
Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I do think that it is very possible to misunderstand what we have just been talking about tonight as some kind of excuse for anti-intellectualism, as though somehow you need to do.
Yeah, I can like that. Yeah.
But that's not. I think actually that architects need to be engaged in the world and the culture, and they should know about other things that are going on. They should read philosophy. They should think their thoughts, and they should follow the news, and they should engage in other forms of connoisseurship, etc. It's more like, just if you want to make a difference in the world, you got to bring some skills to the game. Whatever game you decide to play, you got to skill up. There are a lot of ways to do that. For example, going back to music, I studied music for a long time myself, and I actually was originally self-taught. I played the piano for years by ear. That's one way. That's one way to do it. At some point, though, I had to decide whether or not I was serious about it. And at that point, I actually had to study. And I actually had to undo a lot of the habits that I had learned in my own space of kind of just testing something out. Other people might come to music, and they might take piano lessons like 3 times a week. Maybe they have really hardcore parents, and the parents are like, you must learn piano. And so, there's like, every week they take their piano lessons, and at the end of the day, they drop it as soon as they can, and they go on and do what they really want to do, which is maybe like, I don't know, dental hygienistry or something. There are lots of ways to a passion and a knowledge of something, but it's gotta be something. Otherwise, you won't be able to engage with all the luminous, wondrous, surprising, awesome, intellectually discoveries and opportunities of your own time, because you won't have anything with which to engage them.
And there's also another thing, it also, I don't know, Kevin, if this implies, is not everything is can become anything,
Yeah.
So it's also that some kind of qualities, they talk to other qualities, and not every, and sometimes you realize them, but you will never be sure about them. But I think that's where, I guess, in the end of the day, if you do buildings, you need to see qualities that you can unreveal. If you don't see them, if you cannot find them, I guess it's difficult, it's you need, because only, this is why I got always interested in Oldham A's work, even when I went to the Netherlands because I wanted to hear a lecture by Ram Koolhaas on his architecture. I heard 10 lectures, and none of them were about architecture. They were all about the yes culture, the yen, the Europe, and a kind of neoliberal thing. But in the end of the day, if you look in his building, for example, the Agadir project, it's a hybrid, of the merging of the of the School of the Workers by Leonidov, yeah, meeting Le Corbusier's Unité, you know, and meeting the Casablanca housing project, you know, and meets Van Roy Plinth. So what I'm saying is, eventually there is architectural qualities. Now, Vinnie Maas actually was the one who introduced me, because the project looks like, because he was a landscape. It was a landscape architect, you know, and he actually introduced landscaping into this building. So to me, that's what I suddenly realized, that yes, we can talk about what things can become, what things could be mean, what things are, but eventually, when we do it, when we see buildings, when we design them, what we really have done is we have actually triggered a quality in them that we only could see because of certain kind of expertise and because of certain cultures, you know, and we fuse them together, and there is no discrimination to what kind of knowledge there is. It's always a kind of convergence of various forms of knowledges that trigger them. I mean, I don't know, Kevin. Yeah, at least perhaps this is what how I saw it more and more. You know, as more as I studied some people and some of their work, and that's why I think the interesting thing of the discipline of architecture, it's a very open discourse. It's not a closed one. You can bring new entities in. You can bring new thoughts in. You can bring new buildings in. You know, it's what do you do with them? What do they do? What can you do with them? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in a similar line, I think Danmo had a question. Danmo, do you want to speak, or do you want me to?
Oh yeah. Thank you guys for an amazing lecture. I just want to clarify some thoughts here. I'm just wondering, like, what makes a thing the thing that you guys were talking about? Is it about the relationship with other things, or is this kind of like a process of being discovered, or something, a process of being elevated or sublimated into other things? That makes the thing a thing. But if that's the case, then that intrinsic quality is fundamentally altered, right? Because the object is not the object before, it has turned into something else. I don't know if this is yeah, I just have a little bit of confusion here. Like, what makes a thing the thing?
It would be helpful, I think, Demo, if you would use a specific thing in line with our talk tonight. Because otherwise it becomes, I think we run into the vagaries of vocabulary.
Yeah, for example, like if we're looking at the Campo Marzio's the plan, and then we're kind of like overlaying the Manhattan grid on top of the parts of like Campo Marzio's the plan. And are we bringing two physical qualities together? We're overlaying one thing on top of another, and we're trying to discover something new.
No, perhaps what I mean is, you see, I think if you do architecture, you don't only collage entities or things together, you know, column is meeting a beam or a facade is meeting. What I think when you do architecture is you fuse qualities, you fuse aesthetic properties. Yeah. So what that plan was about, yeah, was to say, what if I take a quality like the subdivision and move it into another plan and read it for this, you know? What comes out is, and this is why I'm not saying, I don't know what a thing is. The only thing what I'm saying is there's an endless amount of reality that is embedded within it that we will never, I mean, this is, if you read the thesis of, yeah, that we'll never have completely access to that. The only thing what we always do as architects is to unreveal a quality we haven't thought is embedded within this quality before. Every good architecture that I have met in my whole life was in principle to originate a quality that we haven't thought a building can look like, you know, or a building can be, or a building can become. The reason why you study architecture is not because I repeat that what I have done. No, is because you actually always try to fuse it with qualities from other entities to unreveal a quality that we haven't thought before. Yeah, this is how I see it. Now, if this thing is called thing, object, whatever, I don't know. I only know it is a quality that is in the world that was not there before. So there is not an end thing. There is I mean, I have no better name. I've taken it from Graham and Harman. There's a zeroness that we will never have access to that thing itself. We only know that that it can come into a multiplicity of entity. My question is only, what do we as architects contribute to this? And my answer is perhaps like arts as well. We try to move qualities in to see if there is something in the world coming that we haven't thought of yet, and otherwise we throw it away and it's not interesting for us, or we know it already and we know what we do with it and it's not relevant, Yeah.
So you guys know, I don't know if any of you grew up with Dr. Seuss, the children's author, but there's The Cat in the Hat, one of the most famous books. Dr. Seuss has in it two characters that are coming to mind, Thing 1 and Thing 2. And Thing 1 and Thing 2 show up with the cat in the hat and they wreak destruction amongst the ordinary domestic things of this house where these kids are on their own. Their mother is not home. And eventually they get caught and they get put back and they cease to wreak havoc. But I always like that Thing 1 and Thing 2 because there's a sense that anything so activated by the kind of careful thought and interest that Peter is describing, for example, with the kinds of plans and the different methods of reading the plans that he was discussing, can be an agent for wreaking havoc. And not all havoc is bad, Sometimes it's like exactly what we need. We absolutely need to rearrange the domestic drudgery of our worlds in some unexpected way. So it's that kind of, let's put it in that kind of active mode rather than the old idea-based notion of dusting and the labor that goes into thinking about what a thing observed is versus what a thing non-observed is versus what a thing next to a thing is. Because I think then we get into, it's like all of a sudden we have to pretend like we're philosophers. And I think Peter is way more philosophically inclined than I am, but I can tell you right now, philosopher I ain't. And I won't be able to contribute anything new over there.
Is it is it right, Danmo or Kevin? You see, you shouldn't forget the only driving force that I have built my whole life is that I was asking myself, what do I do as an architect? What is it? What is my act of doing? What do I do it? There was one idea that I thought, oh, I just take other buildings and reproduce them. I mean, I basically copy them. And then I thought, no, I take some shapes or forms. No, I do some, I don't know, tectonic detailing. I thought I just do something that already was there before. I just repeat it, But then I was wondering, why are there some buildings that I find intriguingly interesting than others? What is that? Why did I so fall in love with this Agadir project when I was a student? And I realized that when I see a debate about architecture, we don't say, oh, look, this looks really like the Greek temple or a Chinese temple. Yeah, one-to-one, exactly right. I even think that it's very difficult to repeat something that is the same. It's nearly impossible. Yeah. because something has changed. You know, for example, I found this very beautiful Chinese diagram of the 13th century about how to make a house, you know, and it's basically the first parametric diagram that I found. That if you take the diameter of a bamboo, yeah, the whole house is basically a multiplicity of construction of a bamboo. So what are you doing if there's no bamboo? Yeah. So yeah. So are you now not making a temple anymore? No. You fuse now suddenly a plastic bamboo. You know what I mean? But yeah. But what does it do is it changes your diagram. So it's really intriguing that I think we we will have no other chance. You know, it's basically what we essentially have to do. I mean, no one told us that we have to do an iPhone. Yeah, in principle, it's nothing else. It's a old camera is moving into a telephone, you know, with some computer chips. You know, yeah. So there is. I go even further, Kevin. Is since I'm a little bit a Simondon thing, I even say it's the inner necessity of the things that they want, you know, to fuse with others. You know, I even could go so far. There is a, Simondon calls it technicity. There is a technicity. There is a own life within matter. You know, I mean, he calls it, well, actually not matter, but in technical things. And it's not an external. So, for example, there's a very nice line that he says, it's not the economical new forms of production that makes industrialization. No, it is within the how to say the assembly line that it becomes industrial. It's within the entities, and I found that intriguing. You know, what if we look at the world? You know, that there is that inner necessity, yeah.
And I think that would actually be the right way to look at architecture. Also, I'm so glad you brought in Simondon.
I mean, look, I've spent a whole book on this now, but I think there is something really intriguing that perhaps it's not that we construct the building. No, the building forces us, you know, or the city forces us to read its entities, you know. You know, I remember when OMA Keola showed the Shenzhen city, you know, it was really intriguing because it was a radical new city, but actually it was not. It forced, you know, to become a material entity, yeah, that is the convergence, yeah, of in principle a multiplicity of histories that have never met before, yeah. You know, scale, size, the Russian grid, the 1 kilometer by grid, the big field, the singular objects, the modern, you know, I mean, so perhaps, you know, it was the will that this is the city that is now to emerge. And I think it's not surprising that